Connected to iPhone. Connected to iPhone.
We're going to tackle this, look at the Hungarian model and pose this question of, is there a future for nation states? Today we'll be joined by two esteemed guests who have two perhaps very different ideas about this. The first is Laszlo György, an economist, and who's recently become Secretary of State for Economic Policy Planning for the state of Hungary. And we have Rana Dasgupta, who is a novelist and essayist. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome to the stage Mr. Rana Dasgupta, novelist and essayist. A big round of applause for Rana. Thanks for joining us. Welcome here. And Mr. Laszlo György. Thanks for joining us today. All right, we flipped the coin. And in the back, you won the coin toss, Rana.
Yeah.
So we'll go ahead and start with your side.
Well, nice to be here. Thank you for coming. This is a wonderful opportunity to discuss some of these important topics. My view on these things is that it's not, I would say, that the age of nation states is over, but the nation states definitely have to be reconstructed completely to deal with the global environment. I think and in this sense, there's not just a Hungarian model, there's a model that is replicating itself in many countries of the world. And one of the things that we have to look at is the way in which, in many countries, the same kinds of things are happening. We have to start to connect these things and not just think about the way that our own countries are working. Very briefly, my background to this would be to say that in the last 40 years, there's been a huge revolution in technology and finance, which has had as its explicit agenda the undermining of national sovereignty so that capital can flow, and we've got to a point now where capital mobility and tax evasion are the fundamentals of the global economy, and one of the products of that in individual nation states is inequality. Levels of inequality that national governments are finding it more and more difficult to do anything about. Now, this revolution is not going to be reversed. We're not going to de-globalize. We're not going to revert to a situation where we have essentially national economies, because we're all dependent now. We all own things like this, which are manufactured all over the world, and we're not going to pull this global economy apart and reconstitute it in several national economies. The situation we have now, however, is one of immense fear and anxiety about this global situation, which produces a new generation of political leaders who come to power on a platform of xenophobia and management of this global system. We see political leaders all over the world trying to expand executive power, identify the states with their own persona. There's a display of power over women and minorities and immigrants, a very aggressive language of war, cultural purity, threat, security. But what I want to argue is that these leaders and any other kind of national response to these problems will not solve the problems. They are not national problems, they're global problems. And the whole point is that they cannot be solved at the national level. And meanwhile, a lot of countries are experiencing an escalation of violence and corruption in their own political systems because of the power of the expanded power of the executive. So my argument here today is that in order for us all to coexist in a global environment, in order for us to have a political mechanism that can manage the economic and technological mechanisms we've established, we need to start to look at transnational management systems. We first of all need to establish transnational systems for the management of global finance, because individual countries can't do it on their own, and national governments are losing the power now to manage to develop their populations. Then we need transnational political systems which do not erode the nation state but enhance the powers of the nation state, in order that we can actually look at things that are affecting all of us, like war and migration. The wars that are happening, which are causing huge amounts of migration to Europe, are not wars that are happening on another planet. They're wars that are part of the economic system we are all part of, which is why migrants are leaving their homes in their thousands to come and try and find refuge in Europe. So that's my position, essentially. Not that the nation state is over, but the nation state is drastically undermined by global systems, and if we want to live in a global environment, we need new global political consciousness.
So in this instance, I summarize it for my own thinking is that the nation states essentially need to start adapting to a collaborative mentality because independently, individually, it's become insurmountable as a task.
Yes, I think nation states need to collaborate, but I think citizens also need to start collaborating because this is also part of a global political environment. Just quickly on that, we are used to the idea that in individual nations, wealthy people will make sacrifices in the name of poorer people. Now, in a global economy, we have to think about how the wealthy of the world can take care of the wealthy of the poor of the world. These kinds of responsibilities now exist in an obvious way. The rich countries of the world are producing mobile phones which are made out of products mined in Africa, and many Africans are losing their homes and their livelihoods as a result of these things. How can we start to establish ethical and political responsibilities between all these groups of people?
Thank you, Rana. All right. Laszlo, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We are always talking about ideas without setting the fundamentals and talking about some numbers and some facts. But this is the reason why I choose to have a proposition with introducing the Hungarian model. The question of the debate is whether there is a future for nation states. In the next less than 5 minutes, I introduce the challenges that were created by globalization in the last 40 years. And I argue that although global solutions are compelling but still utopian, why the Hungarian model works on nation-state level. Let's see what I'm talking about. Let's see the problem through Hungary's example. An average wage earner took home half of the wealth created by her or him in 1970, while only 1/5 in 2010. Why does this change so dramatically? Distinguished scholars of International Labour Organization decomposed the drivers of this income shift. They concluded that the wage share decline is due to natural forces and 29%. What Rana also mentioned, technology change and globalization matters only 29%, meaning moving production from one country to another, and technology change, calculating with technology change. And the decline is due to the change in the rules of the game made by the strongest players of the globalization. The rules of the game of economic policy is 71%. Changes that were managed by the strongest players, introducing tax havens, liberalizing financial markets, making labor markets more flexible, decreasing the bargaining power of labor. So the challenge was created by global forces, actually, which unchained themselves from nation-state level regulations and created a global system that is in favor of them. But this problem is not uniquely Hungarian. These dramatic changes led to a huge dissatisfaction of a large number of voters in such established democracies like the United States or Great Britain. And this led to the phenomenon of Trump and the Brexit. In 30 years, the GDP per capita doubled in the United States, while in the same time, median usual real earnings only increased by 7.8%. In 40 years, the Hungarian GDP grew by 2.4 times, while the net real wage only increased by 28%. So if we focus on that, then we understand what is the disappointment of the citizens of the democracies. We can give both global and local answers on these challenges. In my upcoming book, I summarize the possible global answers. This is called Egyensúly teremtés in Hungarian. It is upcoming in English, titled Setting the Balance. Some of these answers to set the balance between wages and capital in order to make globalization work, to make market capitalism fair and sustainable, were given 46 years ago, some others 15 years ago, by such established scholars, Nobel laureate economists like James Tobin or Joseph Stiglitz. But the problem is that these policy measures have not came into force yet. Some of the ideas were set 46 years ago, but we're not realized on global level. While the Hungarian government shifts around 2.5–3% of the GDP annually from the unfair winners of globalization to the locally disadvantaged. Who are the working families? I explained it. I explained the Hungarian model to some of the most progressive economists around the world, and they said, wow, that's what we are looking for, that's what we are recommending to governments and global thinkers. That is the reason why I had the honor that Dean Baker, the co-founder and director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C., wrote the preface of my upcoming book. So, as a result of this income shift, the net wage share in Hungary increased by 8 percentage points in just 7 years. And this is the core of the Hungarian model. This is an economic policy recipe to win 3 consecutive elections in a row by a 2/3 majority. This is the core of Viktor Orban's economic policy that protects and compensates local democratic communities from the non-elected forces of globalization. This is the evidence that the Hungarian model works. Thank you very much.
All right. So the idea really behind this is that the disproportion of GDP and this trickle-down economy mentality is not working. The dissatisfaction of voters comes from this. But we fail to say that during the majority of these times, right-wing or fairly conservative political bodies were in power during a lot of these times as well. So the contribution might not necessarily be just a globalization versus nation-state concept. Rana, I'll turn it over to you. Your time.
Yes, I think that
why are you being
right
biased
now,
and
there will
hanging
be
on to the
capital
other
flowing
guy?
into a place like this. There is slack in this economy, and I don't think that the national policies can necessarily account for the economic growth in a place in Hungary or in many of the other regions, countries around here, which have very different economic policies but have grown at similar rates. So I think to say that that the Hungarian model is responsible for everything that's going on here is to understate the truth. And I think that countries as much larger than Hungary right now are also battling enormously with some of the issues that you put up on the screen of global financial flows, tax havens, the draining of tax revenues out of their system. And I think that this is what is creating an enormous kind of spiritual malaise in a lot of European and a lot of the rich countries of the world. The malaise is that countries which have experienced in the past a very effective political leadership, countries like this one which have memories of very authoritarian political leadership, are seeing that essentially their leadership is irrelevant to a lot of the things that are happening, that financial flows will happen independently of what political leadership says. If you look at the United States, inequality has risen almost in a straight line since about 1980, independently of whether it was Clinton or Bush or Obama or whoever. So is political leadership really doing anything to change what happens in countries? I think it's clear that that national policy, though of course it can be more or less redistributive, is held to ransom to a very great extent by global forces, and that more and more individual countries will realize that the only way that they can deal with this is to cooperate on it. I agree with you that a lot of the policies that have been proposed have not been implemented, but that is partly because the very basis of our entire global system is mobility and tax evasion, and therefore the forces aligned against any kind of regulation are enormous. Anyone who wishes to see that happen will have to fight a long battle. And I think that what we're talking about here is the need for a political renewal at a global level on a scale that we haven't seen since the 18th century.
Yeah, but that's what I'm arguing, and I agree that we need global solutions, but let's see the history of global solutions. After the First World War, we created the League of Nations. That failed. That was the most democratic way of arguing about our future and our global issues. And then we created a less democratic system. This was the United Nations, which still works, but how does it work? Does it have real solutions on our challenges or problems? Or do nations have some real solutions? I mentioned all the possible solutions which we can realize on global level, but these are not realized in the last 4 decades. I'm telling you that there is a nation-state level, legitimate government, democratically elected government, which has evidence that this income shift that was made by globalizing forces can be turned back. So I don't see any other option now than a nation-state level. Of course, I'm also desire-driven and dream-driven, and I wish if there were global solutions. And the other problem, what you both mentioned, that there were left-wing, leftist, right-wing governments coming and going, and the process, the tendency was the same. Wage earners lost, capital owners win. Well, actually, let's see this iPhone. All of the inventions in this iPhone were financed by taxpayers of the United States. The microchip, the touchpad, the Siri, the GPS, everything was created by the nation state or by the taxpayers of the nation state. DARPA gave an assignment to the country's most beautiful mind in the United States to create this invention. Apple's great invention to make a product out of it. Apple is now sitting on 260 billion US dollars cash reserves. 90% of it is untaxed and is placed in tax havens. Hungary is sitting on around 70 billion US dollars state debt. So the bargaining powers, the positions are pretty much different. So the problem is that this globalization, which we want to change with political measures, with creating a global governance, global political governance, these tendencies are still driven by companies like Apple. We are all cheering for Apple when they agreed with Trump that Trump will decrease, or the Trump government will decrease corporate taxes in the United States from 35% to 21%. This is not the solution. This is part of the problem. Because if corporations will tax even less, then you will have to, the wage earners will have to tax more. So the problem is that these tendencies are still driven by global forces. And as we can see from evidences, only local nation state level government has the legitimacy, if they have around a 2/3 majority, to work against this tide. That's my position.
I think the other aspect of this is that the inability of national governments to control precisely the things that you're talking about. The scale of Apple's offshore reserve of deposits, $200 billion, is comparable to any nation state beyond except China and the United States, their own reserves. So in these situations, you have individual countries which are being held to ransom by private, unelected bodies on a scale of their own scale. Now, what do national leaders do when they discover that they have been elected to solve problems that they simply cannot solve, no matter what policies they put into place? They have to substitute the authority they don't have with other kinds of authority. So you see in all kinds of countries, in Turkey, in India, in Russia, in America, you see leaders who are who inflate their authority by talking about migration issues, borders, security, cultural purity, and in Putin's case, declaring irrelevant wars, which generate all kinds of political capital in the country that he simply can't generate through economic means. So I think that the symptoms of the global malaise are clear for us, and they're very dangerous symptoms. They're dangerous inside countries because they are creating second-class citizens, they are reordering gender relations, they are giving tacit permission in a lot of countries to all kinds of new social violence. But they are also dangerous within nations, because between nations, because war and conflict is a natural outcome of this kind of authoritarian posturing. I think if you think about the Iraq and Syria, they were the first countries ever to be aerial bombed. The civilized countries, I use that in quotes, the civilized countries in Europe decided they wouldn't bomb each other during the First World War. And for the most part they didn't. But as soon as the First World War was over, Britain and France bombed Syrians and Iraqis with no compunction to control colonial revolts. 100 years later, the world is still bombing Syria and Iraq. And somebody has to intervene in the situation and say that people from this part of the world are equal citizens with the rest of us. If we have countries that continue to declare that these are not equal citizens, they do not have equal claims on human rights, we are just perpetuating a system of enormous global violence which will produce more migration and more conflict within countries. These things cannot be solved at national levels. There's no individual nation state that can take up a stand and make sure that the global problems are fixed. These problems have to be fixed with global consensuses, which require new kinds of political conversation.
Absolutely, these problems have to be fixed on global level if we have all the mechanisms to fix them. But if you return to Francis Fukuyama, who at the beginning of the 1990s, end of the 1980s, said that history is over because liberal democracies won. He recently wrote a book on the importance of nation states. As long as Syria or Iraq was a kind of nation state, it had a stability. We didn't face migration. As soon as these nation states were just eradicated, the migration problem appeared. So when we are talking and relating back to the most prestigious, even liberal thinkers, not only conservative thinkers, then they underline the importance of nation states, like Francis Fukuyama or Daron Acemoglu, who argue for nation states in Africa, in the Middle East, in order to solve the problems. On global, I can only repeat myself, on global level, we can talk about problems, but we could not solve any of them, or the most important we could not solve in the last 8 years. Of course, we solved a few, and it's very good that we are advocates of civic rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. We are all advocates of this. We are all advocates of global solutions.
But is it true we're seeing that? Because when these nation states are left to their own devices, a lot of times that's actually not what we're seeing. So that's not justifying the bombing of these nation states, these sovereign states that are no longer treated as such. But in actuality, the corruption of Africa, the corruption of the Middle East, for lots of reasons, and mostly external or global reasons, these are really what is not being addressed. Because to me it sounds more like, and I get this, it's hard to find the policy for this, and I'm not sure exactly what the practical things would be that we'd apply that you're talking about. So they're not clear to me. But it's also not clear to me that turning into yourself, homogenizing your world, and just...
The guy who's moderating the debate is sticking to the other guy's side, and every time this guy says something, he has a rebuttal along, like there's two guys against one. I don't like when the moderator seems to be biased and take sides.
Waiting to see if this all dissolves at one point is the real policy either. Because if you, in an ideal world, what would these nation states do? How would they improve their terms? How would they be less exposed or less corrupted by the external forces that are mining their resources from the beginning?
Actually, Hungary spending the most of the money in the recent 4 years on Stipendium Hungaricum, to advocating foreigners to come to study in Hungary. Hungary helps, Hungary aids. We are spending more than ever on issues, on global issues, than before. So we are not closing in. It's very important to see that we are not closing in. But if there's a danger, there is in every constitution, in the American Constitution, in the Hungarian Constitution, that there are 5 basic values that government has to preserve: national security, freedom, justice, order, and prosperity. And we see, or the Hungarian government acknowledge, that there is a huge threat on national security, and if we want to preserve the way of living, the living standards, the decent life in Hungary, then we have to protect ourselves from such harsh forces while trying to help to solve the problems there. And I would like to ask you, what do you mean about under corruption? If you look at Transparency International rankings, Corruption Perception Index, the worst 6 countries' GDP had to be stolen, the total GDP, for 140 years in order to balance, to level up the money kept by capital owners untaxed in tax havens. So I believe that corruption, that Apple doesn't pay taxes and having 260 billion US dollars in cash reserve, 90% is untaxed, that is a larger corruption.
Well, but
than
I think, Laszlo, you probably get all of us to agree to that idea, that doesn't make sense. I would agree that that's a corrupt concept.
I think that we talk about nation states. There are nearly 200 of them, and we talk about them as if the normal nation state would be, let's say, France or America. These are not normal nation states. These are exceptional nation states that have colonial histories and have been global powers. A normal nation state might be Syria, for instance. A normal nation state might be Morocco. These are countries that are much closer to the middle of things. These are nation states which are representative of most nation states in that they don't have democracy, they're not at peace, they're not affluent. That's what most nation states are today. Now, the thing that has protected nation states from themselves has been democracy. The fact is that a nation state is a monopoly. That's what it is. You give a government a monopoly over tax collection, over violence, over lawmaking, and you trust the government to do things that will be in the name of the people. Now, actually, that's a very unusual situation. Usually, governments don't do things in the name of the people. Usually, governments are co-opted by small clans to run nation states for themselves. The only thing that protects a nation state from that kind of situation is democracy. And in Hungary right now, I think there is a diminishment of democratic process. There is an illusion of party and state, and it's the same in many other countries. In many countries, supposedly democratic countries, you are seeing a lot of the small symbols of democratic process being eroded. And this is a disastrous situation for nation states in general. When nation states collapse into one-party rule, it is a terrifying situation. At that point, no one can argue with this monopoly over violence, tax, etc.
Nation state is a monopoly for 4 years in a democracy. You can go and change, but if people feel that this government is doing right, and they vote for this government, you cannot agree, you can disagree, you can go and vote again in 4 years. But companies like Apple, Google, or these kind of companies, or the oil companies, are monopolies for decades. And that is the problem, that they are still running globalization. If we are creating global government, they will be the ones who will influence it the most. That's what's happening in the United States. I went to Washington, D.C. and New York City last year, and I met Jeffrey Sachs, professor of University of Columbia, and he was a professor of Harvard. And he came to Hungary and this region and helped the liberalization of this area after 1990. And he said the problem in the United States is that in the last 3-4 decades, this is captured by the lobbyists, by those monopolies, what we here in Hungary are fighting against to create a kind of a balance. We don't want to diminish democracy. We would like to create a balance in order to preserve and protect and compensate the locality against these tendencies, what happened in the last 4 decades.
All right. Well, we've heard from both sides here, some compelling stuff. And now we'll turn the opportunity over to you in the audience.
You have an Apple phone and you said it's a corrupt company. Why do you use it?
Is there any cognitive dissonance in that? Do you want me to go back and ride bicycle or just walk to the working place? I'm State Secretary for Ministry for Innovation and Technology. We are using it, we are pragmatic, and we would like you to use, and the kids here to use these tools. Google is brilliant in creating e-learning tools for the kids to learn coding and learn into the digital era. And we are cooperating with Google in this field. But we are still against that they are not paying taxes, because we have to tax you more because they are not paying. I don't feel there any dissonance.
Yes, this question is for Laszlo, George. So, how is it possible to create national level legislation to cope with global warming, or climate change, to be more precise?
According to our vision and mission and goals, our key performance indicators, 95% of energy will be produced in Hungary in a clean way in 2030.
Nuclear energy?
Clean energy meaning no CO2 emissions, zero CO2 emissions. Nuclear, solar, wind.
All right, so my question is to Laszlo. Now, going back to your slide where you discussed that how Hungarian government is funding all the initiatives like supporting the families, tax cuts. Now, hypothetically, if Hungary were to leave EU, say in 3 years' time, how do you plan to fund all those incentives or initiatives you have?
So, okay, we are pro-global solutions. We are pro-European Union. But your question is oversimplified and a little bit populist. If we are talking about EU funds, we have to consider it in a historic level, perspective. In 1992, we entered a free trade zone with the rich, developed countries of the European Union, which destroyed our industry. The employment fell by 1.5 million, by 30% here in Hungary. Now we are compensated for this, and we have to build again our economy, our domestic-owned economy. That is why we are receiving these funds. So I think your question is a little bit oversimplified.
I have a question for the two gentlemen. It's more of a philosophical question. You said that the state has a legitimate monopoly for 4 years, or even more. So what do you do as a citizen when you feel, or more citizens, when you feel that this monopoly is used wrongly and it's year 2 or year 2.5? What should we do then when what you say democratic is turning into something else?
As long as it doesn't harm the constitution, the laws, you can do whatever you want. You can go out and express your devotions, your needs. That's what happened after the elections as well, that people went out to the streets and nobody was hurt. But 12 years ago, many people were shot by rubber guns in the eyes. So I think now we have a much more, maybe it's diminishing, but we have a much more moderate democracy than 12 years ago.
I think this is one of the most important questions of politics today, not just in Hungary, across the world. What can citizens do when the only people they can speak to are their own governments, if their governments are the people are the problem? This is an enormous problem and has been an enormous problem, for instance, in Syria and Iraq. What were people supposed to do who were oppressed by Saddam Hussein except go and complain to Saddam Hussein? This was one of the problems that the League of Nations tried to sort out. If you are oppressed by your government, can there be an authority above your government that you can go and speak to that can come in and intervene? Are there situations in which national governments should surrender their right, morally speaking, to govern a people? Now, I think we have to remember that Europe, let's not think about Europe over 5 years or 10 years, let's think about Europe over 500 years. Europe is a place of religious wars. Europe killed its Jews. We are in a continent that has extremely inflammatory situations around race and religion. So small situations that happen over religion, such as we've seen in France, we've seen in Germany, we've seen all across Europe, these should concern us very, very deeply. I think that the kinds of situations you speak of, we need political mechanisms to be able to monitor governments and speak about them on an ongoing basis. And they may not be within the nation, they may have to be between nations. Otherwise, very, very significant things can happen in a continent like this.
We have this mechanism, I believe. Maybe they can be improved, but we have this mechanism. So your only asset is not only to demonstrate, to go to the Kossuth Square and demonstrate, but you can find your local representative and tell your problems to him or her and help him or her to represent you.
So question to Mr. Das Gupta, please. If the nation state is sort of outdated and has so many flaws, why do so many people across the world and in Hungary, maybe not so many people in this room, but so many people outside of it, continue to identify with it? And how do you feel comfortable telling them that they're wrong?
How do you feel comfortable telling them that they're wrong?
Yeah, but we all live in communities which can be the size of a town, they can be the size of a country, they can be the size of the world. In this part of the world, not in every part of the world, in this part of the world, nation states have a very, very long history. France is 1,000 years old. They're not going to disappear, and people rightly care about their communities. So no one is saying they should disappear, or somebody should undemocratically dismantle them. The problem is not with political communities that exist already. The problem is with the violent redeployment of those communities in order to solve problems that cannot solve. Here we're talking about a situation in which the nation state is dramatically threatened by global forces, especially financial forces, as we've been speaking about and as we both agree. What can you do about that? Should you put somebody in power, such as Prime Minister Modi in India, such as Putin, such as Trump? These figures are not coincidentally always men. Male figures who represent a certain kind of martial confidence to the nation, as if that will give back what has been lost in terms of political authority. It doesn't give anything back. All it does is allow people who don't control finance anymore, but they do control the jails and the borders. It gives them the power to become violent about those kinds of things, but it doesn't actually solve any problems. So if we wish to solve problems, we have to think about new solutions, which may be transnational. They may also be local, because I think the nation state has to give out power downwards as well as upwards. And what I would propose is a situation of nested authority, in which the nation state continues to perform many of the functions it rightly performs today, and for which we are very grateful to it. But where it cannot manage reality, it should give authority away to systems that can manage manage things internationally or locally.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rana. Thank you, Laszlo. It was a pleasure to be with both of you on stage. I really appreciate it. Well done. Give it up for these gentlemen. A really intriguing debate. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Hello. So welcome to this TED Dialogues, the first of a series that's really we've done in response to the current political upheaval. I don't know about you, I've become quite concerned about the growing divisiveness in this country and in the world. No one's listening to each other, right? They aren't. I mean, it feels like we need a different kind of conversation, one that's based on, I don't know, on reason, listening, on understanding, on a broader context. That's at least what we're going to try in these TED Dialogues starting today. And we couldn't have anyone with us who I'd be more excited to kick this off. This is a mind right here that thinks pretty much like no one else on the planet, I would hasten to say. But I'm serious. I'm serious. He synthesizes history with underlying ideas in a way that kind of takes your breath away. So some of you will know this book, Sapiens. Has anyone here read Sapiens? I mean, I could not put it down. The way that he tells the story of mankind through big ideas that really make you think differently about the world. It's kind of amazing. And here's the follow-up, which I think is being published in the US next week.
Yeah, next week.
Homo Deus. Now this is the history of the next 100 years. I had a chance to read it. It's extremely dramatic, and I dare say for some people quite alarming. It's a must-read, and honestly, we couldn't have someone better to help make sense of what on earth is happening in the world right now. So a warm welcome, please, to Yuval Noah Harari. It's great to be joined by our friends on Facebook and around the web. Hello, Facebook. And all of you, as I start asking questions of Yuval, come up with your own questions. Not necessarily about the political scandal du jour, but about the broader understanding of where are we heading. You ready? Okay, we're going to go. So here we are. Yuval, New York City, 2017. There's a new president in power and shockwaves rippling around the world. What on earth is happening?
I think the basic thing that happens is that we have lost our story. Humans think in stories, and we try to make sense of the world by telling stories. And for the last few decades, we had a very simple and very attractive story about what's happening in the world. And the story said that, what's happening is that the economy is being globalized, politics is being liberalized, and the combination of the two will create paradise on earth. And we just need to keep on globalizing the economy and liberalizing the political system, and everything will be wonderful. And 2016 is the moment when a very large segment, even of the Western world, stopped believing in this story. For good or bad reason, doesn't matter. People stop believing in the story. And when you don't have a story, you don't understand what's happening.
I mean, part of you believes that that story was actually a very effective story. It worked.
To some extent, yes. I mean, according to some measurements, we are now in the best time ever for humankind. Today, for the first time in history, more people die from eating too much than from eating too little, which is an amazing achievement. Also, for the first time in history, more people die from old age than from infectious diseases. And violence is also down. For the first time in history, more people commit suicide than are killed by crime and terrorism and war put together. Statistically, you are your own worst enemy. At least from all the people in the world, you're most likely to be killed by yourself. Which is, again, very good news compared to the level of violence that we saw in previous eras.
But this process of connecting the world ended up with a large group of people kind of feeling left out.
Mm-hmm.
And they've reacted, and so we have this bombshell that's sort of rippling through the whole system. I mean, how do you make of what's happened? It feels like the old way that people thought of politics, the left-right divide, has been blown up and replaced. How should we think of this?
Yeah, the old 20th century political model of left versus right is now largely irrelevant. And the real divide today is between global and national, global or local. And you see it, again, all over the world, that this is now the main struggle. We probably need completely new political models and completely new ways of thinking about politics. In essence, what you can say is that we now have global ecology, we have a global economy, but we have national politics. And this doesn't work together. This makes the political system ineffective because it has no control over the forces that shape our life. And you have basically two solutions to this imbalance. Either deglobalize the economy and turn it back into a national economy, or globalize the political system.
So some, I guess many liberals out there view Trump and his government as kind of irredeemably bad, just awful in every way.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see any underlying narrative or political philosophy in there that is at least worth understanding? How would you articulate that philosophy? Is it just the philosophy of nationalism?
I think the underlying feeling or idea is that the political system, something is broken there. It doesn't empower the ordinary person anymore. It doesn't care so much about the ordinary person anymore. And I think this diagnosis of the political disease is correct. With regard to the answers, I'm far less certain. I think what we are seeing is the immediate human reaction. If something doesn't work, let's go back. And you see it all over the world, that people, almost nobody in the political system today has any future-oriented vision of where humankind is going. Almost everywhere you see retrograde vision. Let's make America great again. Like it was great, I don't know, in the 50s, in the 80s, sometime, let's go back there. And you go to Russia, so 100 years after Lenin, Putin's vision for the future is basically, let's go back to the Tsarist empire. And in Israel, where I come from, the hottest political vision of the present is let's build the temple again. So let's go back 2,000 years backwards. So people are thinking, sometime in the past, we've lost it, and sometimes in the past, like you lost your way in the city, and you say, okay, let's go back to the point where I felt secure and start again. And I don't think this can work, but a lot of people, this is their gut instinct.
But why couldn't it work? I mean, America First is a very appealing slogan in many ways. Patriotism is in many ways a very noble thing. It's played a role in promoting cooperation among large numbers of people. Why couldn't you have a world organized in countries, all of which put themselves first?
For many centuries, even thousands of years, patriotism worked quite well. Of course, it led to wars and so forth, but we shouldn't focus too much on the bad. There are also many, many positive things about patriotism and the ability to have a large number of people care about each other, sympathize with one another, and come together for collective action. If you go back to the First Nations, so thousands of years ago, the people who lived along the Yellow River in China, it was many, many different tribes. And they all depended on the river for survival and for prosperity, but all of them also suffered from periodical floods and periodical droughts. And no tribe could really do anything about it because each of them controlled just a tiny section of the river. And then in a long and complicated process, the tribes coalesced together to form the Chinese nation, which controlled the entire Yellow River and had the ability to bring hundreds of thousands of people together to build dams and canals and regulate the river and prevent the worst floods and droughts and raise the level of prosperity for everybody. And this worked in many places around the world. But in the 21st century, technology is changing all that in a fundamental way. We are now living, all people in the world are living alongside the same cyber river. And no single nation can regulate this river by itself. We are all living together in a single planet, which is threatened by our own actions. And if you don't have some kind of global cooperation, nationalism just is not on the right level to tackle the problems of whether it's climate change or whether it's technological disruption.
So it was a beautiful idea in a world where most of the action, most of the issues took place on national scale. But your argument is that the issues that matter most today no longer take place on a national scale, but on a global scale.
Exactly. All the major problems of the world today are global in essence, and they cannot be solved unless through some kind of global cooperation. It's not just climate change, which is like the most obvious example people give. I think more in terms of technological disruption. If you think about, for example, artificial intelligence, over the next 20, 30 years, pushing hundreds of millions of people out of the job market. This is a problem on a global level. It will disrupt the economy of all the countries. And similarly, if you think about, say, bioengineering and people being afraid of conducting, genetic engineering research on humans, it won't help if just a single country let's say the US, outlaws all genetic experiments on humans. But China or North Korea continues to do it. So the US cannot solve it by itself. And very quickly, the pressure on the US to do the same will be immense because we are talking about high-risk, high-gain technologies. If somebody else is doing it, I can't allow myself to remain behind. The only way to have regulations, effective regulations on things like genetic engineering is to have global regulations. If you just have national regulations, nobody would like to stay behind.
So this is really interesting. So it seems to me this may be one key to provoking at least a constructive conversation between the different sides here, because I think everyone can agree that the start point of a lot of the anger that's propelled us to where we are is because of the legitimate concerns about job loss. Work has gone, a traditional way of life has gone, and it's no wonder that people are furious about that. And in general, they have blamed sort of globalism, global elites for doing this to them without asking their permission, and that seems like a legitimate complaint. But what I hear you saying is that so a key question is, what is the real cause of job loss, both now and going forward? To the extent that it's about globalism, then the right response, yes, is to shut down borders and keep people out and change trade agreements and so forth. But you're saying, I think, that actually the bigger cause of job loss is not going to be that at all. It's going to originate in technological questions, and we have no chance of solving that unless we operate as a connected world.
Yeah, I think that I don't know about the present, but looking to the future, it's not the Mexicans or Chinese who will take the jobs from the people in Pennsylvania. It's the robots and algorithms. So unless you plan to build a big wall on the border of California, the wall on the border with Mexico is going to be very ineffective. And I was struck when I watched the debates before the elections. I was struck that certainly Trump did not even attempt to frighten people by saying the robots will take your jobs. Now, even if it's not true, it doesn't matter. It could have extremely effective way of frightening people and galvanizing people. The robots will take your jobs, and nobody used that line. And it made me afraid, because it meant that no matter what happens in universities and laboratories, and there is already an intense debate about it, but in the mainstream political system and among the general public, people are just unaware that there could be an immense technological disruption, not in 200 years, but in 10, 20, 30 years. And we have to do something about it now, partly because most of what we teach children today in school or in college is going to be completely irrelevant to the job market of 2040, 2050. So it's not something we'll need to think about in 2040. We need to think today what to teach the young people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you've often written about moments in history where humankind has entered a new era kind of unintentionally. Like, decisions have been made, technologies have been developed, and suddenly the world has changed, and it may possibly in a way that's worse for everyone. So one of the examples you give in *Sapiens* is just the whole agricultural revolution, which for an actual person tilling the fields, they just picked up a 12-hour back-breaking workday instead of 6 hours in the jungle and a much more interesting lifestyle. So are we at another possible phase change here, where we kind of sleepwalk into a future that none of us actually wants?
Yes, very much so. During the agricultural revolution, what happened is that an immense technological and economic revolution empowered the human collective. But when you look at actual individual lives, the life of a tiny elite became much better, and the life of the majority of people became considerably worse. And this can happen again in the 21st century. No doubt, the new technologies will empower the human collective. But we may end up, again, with a tiny elite reaping all the benefits, taking all the fruits, and the masses of the population finding themselves in worse than they were before. Certainly much worse than this tiny elite.
And those elites might not even be human elites. They might be cyborgs.
Yeah, they could be enhanced superhumans, they could be cyborgs, they could be completely non-organic elites. They could even be non-conscious algorithms. What we see now in the world is authority shifting away from humans to algorithms, more and more decisions about personal lives, about economic matters, about political matters is actually being taken by algorithms. If you ask the bank for a loan, chances are your fate is decided by an algorithm, not by a human being. And the general impression is that maybe Homo sapiens just lost it. The world is so complicated. There is so much data. Things are changing so fast that this thing that evolved on the African savanna tens of thousands of years ago to cope with a particular environment, a particular volume of information and data, it just can't handle the realities of the 21st century. And the only thing that may be able to handle it is big data algorithms. So no wonder that more and more authority is shifting from us to the algorithms.
So we're in New York City for the first of a series of TED Dialogues with Yuval Harari. There's a Facebook Live audience out there. We're excited to have you with us. We're going to start coming to some of your questions and questions of people in the room in just a few minutes. So have those coming. Yuval, if you're going to make the argument that we need to get past nationalism because of the coming technological danger, in a way, that presented by so much of what's happening. So we've got to have a global conversation about this. Trouble is, it's really hard to get people really believing that, I don't know, AI really is an imminent threat and so forth. The things that people, some people at least, care about much more immediately, perhaps, is climate change and perhaps other issues like refugees, nuclear weapons, and so forth. How would you argue that in where we are right now, that somehow those issues need to be dialed up? But I mean, so you've talked a lot about climate change, but I mean, Trump has said he doesn't believe in that. So we can't, in a way, your most powerful argument, you can't actually use to make this case.
Yeah, I think with climate change, at first sight, it's quite surprising that there is a very close correlation between nationalism and climate change. I mean, almost always the people who deny climate change are nationalists. And at first sight, you think, why? What's the connection? Why don't you have socialists denying climate change? But then when you think about it, it's obvious. Because nationalism has no solution to climate change, if you want to be a nationalist in the 21st century, you have to deny the problem. If you accept the reality of the problem, then you must accept that, yes, there is still room in the world for patriotism, there is still room in the world for having special loyalties and obligations towards your own people, towards your own country. I don't think anybody's really thinking of abolishing that. But in order to confront climate change, we need additional loyalties and commitments to a level beyond the nation. And it should not be impossible, because people can have several layers of loyalty. You can be loyal to your family and to your community and to your nation. So why can't you be also loyal to humankind as a whole? Of course, there are occasions when it becomes difficult, what to put first, and then, but life is difficult, handle it.
Okay, so I would love to get some questions from the audience here. We've got a microphone here, speak into it, and Facebook, get them coming too.
So one of the things that has clearly made a huge difference in this country and other countries is the income distribution inequality, the dramatic change in income distribution in the U.S. from what it was 50 years ago and around the world. Is there anything that we can do to affect that? Because that gets at a lot of the underlying causes.
So far I haven't heard a very good idea about what to do about it. Again, partly because most ideas remain on the national level and the problem is global. I mean, one idea that we hear quite a lot about now is universal basic income. But this is a problem. I mean, I think it's a good start, but it's a problematic idea because it's not clear what universal is and it's not clear what basic is. Most people, when they speak about universal basic income, they actually mean national basic income. But the problem is global. Let's say that you have AI and 3D printers taking away millions of jobs in Bangladesh of all the people who make my shirts and my shoes. So what's going to happen? The US government will levy taxes on Google and Apple in California and use that to pay basic income to unemployed Bangladeshis. If you believe that, you can just as well believe that Santa Claus will come and solve the problem. So unless we have really universal and not national basic income, the deep problems are not going to go away. And also, it's not clear what basic is. Because what are basic human needs? 1,000 years ago, just food and shelter is enough. But today people will say education is a basic human need. It should be part of the package. But how much? 6 years, 12 years, PhD? Similarly with healthcare. Let's say that in 20, 30, 40 years, you'll have expensive treatments that can extend human life to 120, I don't know. Would this be part of the basket of basic income or not? It's a very difficult problem because in a world when people lose their ability to be employed, the only thing they're going to get is this basic income. So what's part of it is a very, very difficult ethical question.
And there's a bunch of questions on how the world affords it as well. Who pays the numbers of daughter? There's a question here from Facebook from Lisa Larson. Mm-hmm. How does nationalism in the US now compare to that between World War I and World War II in the last century?
Well, the good news, we're in a much, with regard to the dangers of nationalism, we're in a much better position than a century ago. A century ago, 1917, Europeans were killing each other by the millions. In 2016 with Brexit, as far as I remember, a single person lost her life. An MP who was murdered by some extremist. Just a single person. I mean, if Brexit was about British independence, this is the most peaceful war of independence in human history. And if, let's say that Scotland will now choose to leave the UK after Brexit. So in the 18th century, if Scotland wanted, and the Scots wanted several times, to break out of the control of London, the reaction of the government in London was to send an army up north to burn down Edinburgh and massacre the Highland tribes. My guess that if in 2018 the Scots vote for independence, the London government will not send an army up north to burn down Edinburgh. Very few people are now willing to kill or be killed for Scottish or for British independence. So for all the talk of the rise of nationalism and going back in the 1930s or to the 19th century, in the West at least, the power of national sentiments today is far, far smaller than it was a century ago.
Although some people now, you hear, publicly worrying about whether that might be shifting, and that there could actually be outbreaks of violence in the US depending on how things turn out. Should we be worried about that, or do you really think things have?
No, we should be worried. I mean, I think we should be worried of two things. First of all, don't be hysterical. We are not back in the First World War yet, but on the other hand, don't be complacent. We reached from 1917 to 2017, not by some divine miracle, but simply by human decisions. And if we now start making the wrong decisions, we could be back in an analogous situation to 1917 in a few years. One of the things I know as a historian is that you should never underestimate human stupidity. It's one of the most powerful forces in history is human stupidity and human violence. Humans do such crazy things for no obvious reason. But again, at the same time, another very powerful force in history is human wisdom. We have both. So
we have with us here moral psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who I think has a question.
Well, thanks, Yuval. So you seem to be a fan of global governance, but when you look at the map of the world from Transparency International, which rates the level of corruption of political institutions, it's a vast sea of red with little bits of yellow here and there for those with good institutions. Mm-hmm. So if we were to have some kind of global governance, what makes you think that it would end up being more like Denmark rather than more like Russia or Honduras? And aren't there alternatives, such as we did with CFCs? I mean, there are ways to solve global problems with national governments. What would world government actually look like, and why do you think it would work?
Well, I don't know how it would look like. Nobody still has a model for that. The main reason we need it is because many of these issues are loose.
All right, guys, I'm gonna get out of here. Damn. When I come back, I'll start working on that background a little bit more. Try to add some more lettering to the book, and this piece is almost done. A little more highlights on his shirt. I'm looking at maybe another 4 or 5 hours, possibly, and it'll be a wrap. All right, guys. I'm out. Peace.